Redistricting reform and legal issues in the Trump administration swirl around the national headlines. We get some legal and political perspective from former Attorney General Eric Holder on this edition of Iowa Press.
Funding for Iowa Press was provided by Friends, the Iowa Public Television Foundation, the Associated General Contractors of Iowa, the public's partner in building Iowa's highway, bridge, and municipal utility infrastructure.
I'm a dad.
I am a mom.
I'm a kid.
I'm a kid at heart. I'm a banker.
I'm an Iowa banker.
No matter who you are, there is an Iowa banker who is ready to help you get where you want to go. Iowa Bankers, allowing you to discover the genuine difference of Iowa banks.
For decades, Iowa Press has brought you politicians and newsmakers from across Iowa and beyond. Now celebrating more than 40 years of broadcast excellence on statewide Iowa Public Television. This is the Friday, June 21 edition of Iowa Press. Here is David Yepsen.
Iowa's nonpartisan redistricting procedures are heralded as some of the best in the nation. Every 10 years, the state's nonpartisan Legislative Services Agency drafts new congressional and state house district lines without political party manipulation. But gerrymandered districts in other states started legal battles that have been waged all the way to the Supreme Court. It's a fight over the future of Congress and state houses across the country. One of those leading efforts to change redistricting practices is today's guest, former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder. He served across 2 terms in the Obama administration. Mr. Holder, welcome to Iowa and to Iowa Press.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Good to have you with us. Across the table today, Erin Murphy is Des Moines Bureau Chief for Lee Enterprises, and Katarina Sostaric covers politics for Iowa Public Radio.
Mr. Holder, the U.S. Supreme Court is considering the constitutionality of gerrymandering, which is the redrawing of legislative and congressional district lines to benefit a political party. How do you think the court will rule?
I'm concerned. I thought that in the previous occasion when the court was considering the case, Justice Kennedy had indicated at least some willingness to say that, partisan gerrymandering can go too far. The court has already said racial gerrymandering is still governed by the Voting Rights Act. But with Justice Kennedy's replacement by Justice Kavanaugh, it's kind of a blank slate in some of the oral arguments that were heard. He doesn't seem to be leaning towards putting limits on a practice that I think all who I think are neutral would say has really had a negative impact on our democracy. And so I'm not sure how the court is going to rule.
If you lose, what will you do?
Well, I'm head of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, and what we are trying to do is get at partisan gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering around the country. We have a multi-pronged strategy. We bring lawsuits. We support candidates who will stand for fair redistricting. We are in favor of reform efforts, and that chiefly being the creation of these nonpartisan commissions. And then we have an advocacy arm as well, so that if the Supreme Court does not do anything in the case that is before it, doesn't hurt the other ways in which we can bring cases. But we also will use the state constitutions to bring cases, as we did in Pennsylvania, where the Supreme Court in Pennsylvania said that the state constitution had been violated by what Republicans did in that state and ordered a redrawing of the maps.
David mentioned that Iowa's process is hailed by many people for its nonpartisan approach. Do you agree with that? Do you consider Iowa as a model approach to redistricting?
Yeah, I actually do. You have really kind of career civil servants who are, in the first instance, drawing the maps. And we always hold out Iowa as well as Arizona and California as the gold standard. California and Arizona use nonpartisan commissions, but the way in which Iowa has approached this issue, I think, is something that should be emulated.
So why hasn't that caught on in other places yet? What's the pushback to moving to something similar to what Iowa or some of those other states do?
Well, because what you're doing is taking power away from politicians and putting it where I think it ought to be, in the hands of the people. the prime directive for politicians is to get re-elected. And so if you can make that easier by creating these safe districts, that is what they want to do. Now, in 2011, Republicans really engaged in partisan gerrymandering, the likes of which we had not seen for the last half century. Princeton did a study and made that conclusion. And so now to try to get to a point where it's a more fair process, you're in essence going to be asking those people who are in office to give up some power, some degree of certainty that they're going to be reelected, and that's what makes it difficult.
And so how do you do that? How do you convince someone to give up something that helps them get reelected?
Well, public pressure. I think that's what that advocacy part of our effort is all about. When people are given the opportunity to express themselves through ballot initiatives, they overwhelmingly support the creation, for instance, of these independent commissions. And then we bring lawsuits as well, because at some point, gerrymandering can become so bad, it seems to me, that, and this is certainly what we've argued in our briefs, that it becomes unconstitutional. You're actually having a negative impact on people's expression, people's ability to express themselves politically.
Now, your effort is an effort by the Democratic Party. Are you getting any help from Republicans anywhere along the line?
Not a substantial amount, although I will say that there have been at least a couple of people. I've done events with Arnold Schwarzenegger, the former governor of California. He is really in favor of, and what I think is actually, in addition to Iowa, the best way of doing this, which is the creation of these independent commissions. He and I penned a piece that ran in New Hampshire, I guess just a couple of days or so ago. We did an event together in Washington, D.C. at the National Press Club. But it's hard to find Republican support because, as I said, the reality of this is that if we are successful in our efforts, Republicans are going to lose power in states that are extremely gerrymandered, like Wisconsin, Ohio, Michigan, North Carolina, which is almost like ground zero for gerrymandering, Texas. So it's I'd like to have more Republican partners in this effort, but they're not many.
But there are examples of Democrats doing gerrymandering. I'm thinking of Illinois, Maryland.
Yeah. There's no question. We have been dealing with gerrymandering for almost as long as we have had a republic. That doesn't mean that we should accept this negative impact on our democracy. And what I have done is where Democrats have tried to use the power that they have to gerrymander, as they tried to do in New Jersey, to be very public about my opposition to it. And along with the governor there, we forced legislators in New Jersey to back down. So I'm against gerrymandering regardless of who does it. How
realistic is it for you to expect change in this highly partisan time that we live in? I mean, people may agree with you, but it's such a partisan divide in our country today. How do you work against that?
Well, part of the partisan divide that we have and the cynicism that we have is because of gerrymandering, where people are in these safe districts, and the only thing that people fear in these safe districts is a primary, not a general election. And so if you reach across the aisle to cooperate with your political opponent, that is seen as a sign of weakness, and it drives people further and further to the right, people further and further to the left, and that increases gridlock, increases cynicism, and so one of the prime pushers of the system that you just have, I think, adequately described, or the condition of this country that I think you've adequately described, is in fact gerrymandering. And so I think what we have to do is tap into that frustration that people feel about government, the lack of solutions to the problems that people generally want to see occur, and hopefully use that power to push people in the political sphere to do things that maybe they instinctively don't want to do.
And you also mentioned you're concerned about racial gerrymandering. We've been talking about partisan, Republicans and Democrats, but is racial gerrymandering a big problem?
Yeah, it is something that we still have to confront. The Supreme Court has recently just looked at a case in Virginia where a case was successfully brought. The Virginia legislature tried to pack African Americans into districts to try to decrease their political influence throughout the rest of the state. And so that's still a problem. But there we have tools that we don't necessarily have after the Shelby County decision. It kind of gutted the Voting Rights Act. But when it comes to racial gerrymandering, the VRA, the Voting Rights Act, in the Constitution are of greater assistance than we have with regard to partisan gerrymandering.
How do you find the perfect balance here? I mean, it's an issue of what they call cracking and packing. You can't take a racial group and break them up into so many groups that they have no influence. But on the other hand, you can't pack them together either, just so that there's only one member of that group and get elected, and it makes a lot of other all white districts, or primarily white. How do you find that balance?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some neutral principles that can be applied. You want to have districts that are relatively as small as you can make them, contiguous, that keep communities of interest together, that are respecters of natural boundaries. I mean, there's a district in in Virginia that's only contiguous when the James River is at high tide. You know, that's the kind of thing that you don't want to have. So if you apply neutral principles, I think you can come up with districts that are consistent with the aims of the Voting Rights Act, which is to make sure that communities of interest maintain or have power that they should have, but also don't create these districts that are overly safe. Now, some districts are going to be safe just by the way in which people live, but the things that we are fighting are these artificial barriers that have created districts that look extremely bizarre and that guarantee certain results.
Mr. Holder, what do you think of the performance of the current Attorney General, William Barr?
I have to tell you, I'm both surprised and extremely disappointed. I actually thought that he was an institutionalist, and I thought that he would actually be at odds with President Trump relatively soon in his tenure, and he's proved to be anything but that. He has become a defender of the president, a protector of the president, and has done things inconsistent with what I think an attorney general is supposed to do. I think he's tended to think of himself as the lawyer for the president as opposed to the attorney for the people of this country.
You were held in contempt of Congress. What do you make of current efforts by House Democrats to hold William Barr in contempt, and is it all just very political?
There's a political component to this, but I think that the two instances are really fundamentally different. You look at the contempt that I was cited for. We turned over 7,700 pages of documents. I testified up to like 10 times on this fast and furious matter. We made other people in the Justice Department available to testify. That vote, very interestingly, was scored by the National Rifle Association, and that was really kind of the driver of that contempt vote. Here you've got a situation where the administration, the Attorney General, are kind of making a blanket determination that they're just not going to make people available, they're not going to share documents, and that's inconsistent with the way in which the legislative branch is supposed to do oversight with the executive branch. And there's always some give and take, there's always some negotiating. When we tried to negotiate, when I was held in contempt, they simply didn't want to negotiate. They wanted to have that contempt vote. I don't see that here. In fact, I've seen, Chairman Nadler, other members of the leadership, I think, be fairly reasonable in how they've been interacting with the Justice Department and other members of the executive branch. But I think it's time to be a little less reasonable and time to start pushing them for documents and for witnesses. We don't want to string this out, and it seems clear to me what the Trump administration is trying to do here.
Mr. Holder, the president said recently that he doesn't find it necessary to report to the FBI if a foreign government or a foreign actor comes with offers of help on a political campaign. Do you agree with that statement?
No. I mean, that's shocking. It's appalling. And to have a president of the United States say that if a foreign power was to offer me information, I wouldn't immediately reject it and report it is pretty frightening. Because the reality is, once you interact with that foreign power, they've got something on you. They have something on you that they will undoubtedly try to use. And the fact that this president doesn't understand that either expresses to me some degree of venality or ignorance or some combination thereof. But in any case, to have the leader of this nation make a statement like that is totally inappropriate.
Mr. Holder, there's a big debate in the Democratic Party over whether the President of the United States should be impeached. Nancy Pelosi's position, no, let's do it at election time, try to get rid of him in the election. Other Democrats are saying, no, we have an obligation. What advice do you have? Where do you come down in this discussion?
Well, I think on the basis of the Mueller report, the volume 2 on the obstruction, I think there's clearly a basis to begin impeachment proceedings. And it would seem to me that that's kind of the way to go, to try to find ways in which we can, you need to actually conduct the hearings to get information from people. The Mueller report, I think, is a good guide in that way. So I don't know whether you call it impeachment proceedings or you just do it through the regular Judiciary Committee oversight, but you need to acquire information. And once that information is acquired, then make a determination about whether impeachment proceedings are appropriate.
I heard from some Republicans, including our U.S. Senator here, Chuck Grassley, who agrees with you that a campaign should report anytime a foreign actor gets involved. But he also said that the kind of reaction, the fear over all this is unbalanced and unfair relative to the news that the Clinton campaign and the DNC had paid a former British spy to find information on Donald Trump during the 2015-2016 campaign. Is that a fair comparison? Should there have been equal anger over that as well?
Now, let me be clear. Let me be real clear here. That's a red herring. This notion of looking at why this whole investigation began into the possibility of conspiracy between the Trump campaign and the Russians. We had career people going through the FISA court on what seems to me, a justified basis to begin an investigation. And they've somehow tried to make this seem as if it's something that is inappropriate. Look, I signed hundreds of FISA warrants. Those things go through the Justice Department, are really screened before they are submitted to a neutral Article III court, the FISA court. And this is really just an attempt to divert attention from the very real concerns that we ought to have about the degree of cooperation that existed between a foreign government and the Trump campaign. That's nonsense. That's absolute nonsense.
So to the broader question of election security, what we do know is that we have foreign governments trying to get involved in our elections. What's your view of where we're at with, do we have secure elections? Can we feel confident going into next year that, the votes cast will be counted accurately and safely? Or in your mind, does something more? Do we need more safeguards in place?
I think that's a really good question, and it ought to be a greater concern for us as a nation. We have focused so much on, the Mueller report. We have focused so much on obstruction, but we've not really asked ourselves, all right, we know that the Russians came in 2016. What have we done between then and now to prepare ourselves for what inevitably is going to happen in 2020 when they're going to be coming back? And we have done little or nothing. I know, the basis of relationships that I have, that certain things have been proposed within the Justice Department, within DHS, by career people that have surfaced and have really not been acted upon by the political leadership there. And I think the concern that the administration has is if they put these measures in place, it will somehow delegitimize the election in 2016 and almost be an admission on their part that there was, in fact, a problem that they have to ultimately acknowledge if we're going to get to a place where we minimize the possibility that a foreign power could have an impact on the 2020 elections.
To stay on the theme of elections, there have been laws passed across the country that suppress voter turnout. How bad is that situation around the country, and have Democrats found ways to counter that?
The situation is very bad, and there's also a connection between that voter suppression and gerrymandering, because you see the greatest amount of voter suppression where you see the greatest amount of gerrymandering. And the Shelby County decision really kind of gutted the Voting Rights Act and did away with this notion of preclearance when one of the covered jurisdictions wanted to change an electoral process. They had to come to the Justice Department to make sure that it didn't have an inappropriate impact on certain groups. Shelby County decision is made, and almost immediately you see these legislatures going into session and passing these unnecessary photo ID laws and other measures to try to keep people away from the polls. I worry about foreign intervention, but I also worry about domestic policies that have been put in place that potentially are going to keep hundreds of thousands, millions of people away from the polls. That's a very, very serious problem.
But Republicans say that these policies are needed to protect election integrity.
And that's another red herring. They keep talking about voter fraud, and it doesn't exist to the extent that they say that it does. They tried to put together a commission to look at potential voter fraud around the country, headed by this guy, Chris Kobach, and it fell apart. simply because there was no there there. No, what they're trying to do with these techniques is to keep certain people away from the polls, people who they perceive to be Democratic leaning, people of color, young people. Want to keep them away from the polls. I mean, in Texas, they had a system where if you had a photo ID issued by the state of Texas that allowed you to carry a concealed weapon, that was fine. You could vote. If you had a state-issued photo ID that showed you were a student at the University of Texas, that was not sufficient. And in a lot of ways, that tells you what they are trying to do with this whole photo ID scheme.
Mr. Holder, the Attorney General Barr recently said that he could see a scenario where a journalist could be jailed for not revealing sources. For as much criticism as that received under your Department of Justice was also criticized for cracking down on sources and leakers' use of the Espionage Act. Did you set us on this path? Is your department partially to blame for a situation where the Justice Department is now being more aggressive in its approach with journalists?
I'll certainly take the heat for things that I did, but I'm not going to take the heat for this one. We were, I think, appropriate going after people who went against their oaths and shared classified information. But I made very clear and said on any number of occasions that we would never, ever go after a reporter who was simply doing his or her job and using that information to report on that which had been shared by somebody perhaps who was breaking their oath. Our focus was always on the leaker and not on the media.
And I think the argument is that it create a legal gray area, though, to open the door for future departments to use that same argument to go after journalists instead of the leaker.
Well, an attorney general, a Justice Department's got to use the discretion that it has and act appropriately. I thought that we were appropriately sensitive to, the very important role that the media plays, and that's why I made that statement on repeated occasions that we would never go after a reporter. We would only go after the leakers. And what this administration has talked about is a leap from as far as we were willing to go, and as I said, a leap beyond that which I expressed.
Mr. Holder, you've been active in trying to fight hate crimes. What's the status of those efforts, and do you think additional legislation is needed?
Yeah, I worry a great deal. If you look at the statistics, you'll see a rise in hate crimes, anti-Semitic based hate crimes, crimes against Muslims. We have laws on the books, and I think they have to really be enforced. We have to be sensitive to this rise, this environment, this atmosphere that the administration has created, and we have to make sure that we are protecting people who are the subjects of these really kind of odious crimes. It's something that I spent a lot of time on, both as the United States Attorney in Washington, D.C., and also in my time as Attorney General. And I think it's something that is worthy of both federal attention and making sure that our state and local counterparts have the necessary resources to be really aggressive in getting at the prevention of these kinds of crimes.
Did you have a follow-up?
No.
Okay. Felon voting.
Mm-hmm.
What do you make of efforts around the country to restore voting rights to people who've been convicted of a felon? It's an issue here in this state. Republican governors was supportive of it. It didn't go anywhere yet. What's your thought about that?
Yeah, I think it's fair. It's the right thing to do, and it also really deals with a historical wrong. Once people have paid their debt to society, they're out of prison, they're finished with probation, they're finished with parole. I think that you should have a restoration of voting rights, especially when you see who is impacted by these felon disenfranchisement rules, disproportionately people of color. And then when you look at the history of these things, you'll see that, after the Civil War, as freed slaves start to use the political strength that they have as new citizens, the establishment in the South decided, well, no, we can't have that. We're going to put in place a felon disenfranchisement scheme, which on its face seems relatively neutral. Well, then you go out and start arresting, substantial numbers of African Americans. And that has carried over into the 20th and then the 21st century. And with this mass incarceration problem that we have, that makes substantial numbers of African Americans, Hispanics, brings them into the system, brands them as felons, and then takes away their voting rights. That has really had a negative impact on the participation of people of color in our democratic system. Now, I'm a prosecutor, and I think people certainly ought to be held accountable. But once you've paid your debt, it seems to me that the restoration of those rights ought to be something that occurs, not through the discretion of a governor, but just automatically.
Erin, just a minute.
I've just got just a couple of minutes left to talk some political things. You're in Iowa, but do you remain one of the few Democrats who is not running for president?
I think I may be the only Democrat not running for president right now. But I have an announcement to make. No, I'm just...
Do you plan to endorse in this primary field?
No, I think that I'll probably remain neutral as a person who's pushing the National Democratic Redistricting Committee to deal with this problem of partisan gerrymandering, and also trying to enlist the people who are running for our party's nomination. I'm asking them to sign a pledge to say that they will talk about this problem of partisan gerrymandering. They will make this a part of their platforms. And it's also in their interest that we are successful here, because the reality is, if a Democrat wins in 2020, and I think a Democrat will win, that person's agenda could be hobbled by a gerrymandered House of Representatives, which is created by gerrymandered state legislatures. And so it's in their interest, and I think it's also the right thing to do. So I don't plan on endorsing.
Mr. Holder, we're out of time.
Oh, okay.
Thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us. We'll be back next week for another edition of Iowa Press at our regular times, 7:30 Friday night and noon on Sunday, and anytime on iptv.org. For all of us here at Iowa Public Television, I'm David Yepsen, and thanks for joining us today.
Funding for Iowa Press was provided by Friends, the Iowa Public Television Foundation, the Associated General Contractors of Iowa, the public's partner in building Iowa's highway, bridge, and municipal utility infrastructure.
I'm a dad.
I am a mom.
I'm a kid.
I'm a kid at heart. I'm a banker.
I'm an Iowa banker.
No matter who you are, there is an Iowa banker who is ready to help you get where you want to go. Iowa Bankers, allowing you to discover the genuine difference of Iowa banks.